Everybody's here. Can you hear this all right? No. How about now? Okay. Okay, off to a great start. Good morning. Welcome to Great Decisions 2019. I'm Larry Bach. I'm the president of the World Affairs Council of Greater Hampton Roads, and I welcome you to the 6th of our 8 programs, which are designed to address the most important foreign policy issues of our day. As you know, the World Affairs Council here in Hampton Roads has been serving our community for 50 years now, and the mission among the other 92 councils throughout the nation is to promote awareness and understanding, most importantly, of our top international affairs and foreign policy issues. And I think you'll agree that never has been more important than it is today. And I think today's topic is another one that we really need to discuss, and one that's most important in our series. So with that, I would like to thank our sponsors, especially the Norfolk Arts and Humanities Commission, the Slover Library and Foundation, and our host here, Norfolk Academy, for sponsoring us on this particular event, as well as the other sponsors you see in your programs. Their investment in us is really an investment in our community. So with that, I would like to turn the program over to Dr. David Russellman, our host here at Norfolk Academy, who will introduce today's program.
Good morning. It's an honor to introduce Susan Zelle. Originally, I thought I'd be reading her bio, so I'm disappointed that I won't get to show off that I learned how to pronounce Injamina. Is that good? I looked it up. Suffice it to say, Susan worked as a Foreign Service officer for 25 years and then spent another dozen years being sent by the State Department to straighten out problems at embassies and consulates around the world. On a personal note, it's a genuine pleasure to welcome her back to Norfolk Academy. She came here for years to work with students here in grades 9 through 12 in an International Relations Fellows program. We have alumni in that program now at places like Duke, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and of course Duke, right? Armand's winning them all. And I'm sure in 10 years from now we'll have alumni from that program in places like the intelligence community, the Foreign Service, USAID. The success of those students is in large part to the inspiration of role models like Susan and others that I consciously put in front of our best and brightest. I've heard Susan speak many times, and I can tell you we're in for a real treat. So please join me in welcoming Susan Zelle.
Good morning. Let's see how this is going to work. Dave, thank you. It's really nice to be back here. If anyone can't hear me, because I'm sort of juggling this and some notes, raise your hand as we go along, and I'll try to... I'm happy to be here and really address what for me is a very difficult topic. I attended the first Great Decisions course in Asheville. It was on refugees and global migration, which I think you have coming up in your rotation. The professor came very well prepared, and he had this spiffy PowerPoint with statistics and all this, and I thought, well, darn, why didn't I get that one? That would have been so relatively easy. But by the end of his presentation, to be honest, there were so many facts and figures that we were all lost and we were confused and troubled. This isn't a subject which lends itself very well to PowerPoint, so stick with me. We're going to do this without PowerPoint, and this seems particularly difficult in a military-oriented group, but stick with me. If you have questions as we go along, that you're not following something, again, raise your hand and I'll try to bring things back. I think the most poignant remark that I've heard about the shutdown was from a DC-based diplomat who said, I've worked in some developing countries which have barely functioning governments, but I never thought I'd be going to soup kitchens or applying for unemployment in the United States. I think that speaks volumes about the state of morale in the Department of State, something that I'll get into a bit more as we go along. It's both an advantage and a disadvantage having me here today to speak to you. The disadvantage is that I haven't been overseas in a couple of years. I think it's outweighed by the advantage, which is that I can really speak bluntly without fear of any repercussions. So I'm a blunt speaker to begin with, as Dave knows, but perhaps I've gotten blunter. I don't want to get bogged down in the minutia of each possible foreign service policy change. And I say possible because, for me, waking up to read the president's tweets or the latest pundits' take on the political developments is a little like watching a game of ping pong. And I don't enjoy it, and I don't think it's very useful. So we're going to focus on the health of the Department of State, the importance of a consistent foreign policy, and of course morale. So who are we and what do we do? How many of you actually know a diplomat? Okay, this is good, this is good. So what do we do? The boring answer is we represent the United States, we protect our citizens, and we advance U.S. interests around the world. That kind of sounds bureaucratic. But the cool answer is we do everything under the sun. So here's a few of things that I've done that I found very interesting. I swore in new Peace Corps volunteers one day, and I listened to an American rapper that evening. I did visa interviews one morning to decide who could study or visit the United States, and I toured a toothbrush factory after lunch. I flew up to a contested area of Congo with the UN to negotiate with the rebel leader on confidence-building measures to diffuse tensions. I attended political trials of dissidents, and I taught public speaking courses to our employees. So we push American products. We help American businesses get a foot in the door. We grant, or in most cases we deny, visas to those who want to study or visit the United States, or to those who want to immigrate to the United States or become American citizens. We make sure that they get a fair trial and that they're not mistreated. We replace lost American passports, we find lost Americans, and sometimes we support lost causes. We can talk a little more about those things. Because we live in a country for 2 to 4 years and we're immersed in the culture and the everyday life of that country, we gain insights about that country that you don't get from books. We develop contacts who become trusted friends. We go where average travelers can't or don't want to go. Diplomats are like journalists. We have a license to be interested in anything. We follow local, national, and international events like news hounds, in the best sense of news hounds, that we're always interested in what's going on. We take the country's temperature by keeping in touch with journalists, opposition leaders, businessmen, taxi drivers, and tour operators. We analyze what we've been told and what we observe, and we try to predict how it will affect the United States. Good diplomats don't sit in their offices. They get out and about, and hopefully outside the capital city where they're usually posted. They're constantly on the move, talking to a variety of people. I'll talk a little bit about one of my favorite subjects, promoting democracy. How is the Trump method helping or hurting this process? What is the Trump method? Is diplomacy still valid in today's technologically advanced world? State employs 8,000 foreign service officers, and I'm going to refer to them often, the diplomats or foreign service officers, as FSOs. Just clue you in when you hear FSOs, I'm talking about diplomats. We also employ another 5,000 foreign service specialists. Of these 13,000 people, more or less 9,000 are overseas at any one time. We also have 11,000 civil servants who work in the U.S. and about 45,000 local employees who help us run our embassies around the world. We spend the majority of our careers overseas because, frankly speaking, that's where the work is and that's where the fun is. That's the challenge. And if you're going to work for state, why would you want to just live in Washington, D.C.? You join state because you like living overseas. You like learning about foreign cultures. We work in almost 300 embassies, consulates, and missions around the world, including several here in the United States. So I mentioned that this is a technologically advanced world, and we rely more and more on technology to identify and sometimes even solve problems. What does state bring to the table? Our civil servants bring decades of experience, in very highly intricate fields like non-proliferation and international legal issues and drug eradication efforts around the world. They stay in one job, and they have a specialty in that one job. Diplomats, you'll see, move around every 2 to 3 years. So what can we add? Well, we speak the languages of the places where we're posted. We develop a regional specialty that gives us a context about what's going on, and experience usually in a particular field. So it might be a consular officer, it might be someone who deals with economic trade policy, it might be someone who's a political analyst. We're the human face of American diplomacy overseas, the people who explain, carry out, and sometimes apologize for U.S. policy. We protect Americans, and we help build the coalitions that we find we need around the world to deal with our foreign policy issues. After I retired, Dave said I continued to do these 2 to 3 month stints, TDYs, in Africa, filling gaps and serving as a kind of troubleshooter. By then, I lived in so many African countries that when I arrived, I had knowledge and I also had credibility. I went back to a number of countries where I'd served, and I went to a lot of new, cool countries like N'Djamena, Chad. It's often said that we spend way too much money on our international obligations. So this audience is probably pretty savvy. How much of our budget do we spend on the Department of State? Anyone want to guess? 10%? 10%? 2%? 1%? How about, how much do we spend on aid? That's way out of control now. How much are we spending on aid? Less than 1%. Less than 1%. Okay. So whoever said 1% for state is very close. We spend less than 1%, 0.7% of our total budget. It rose from 2000 to 2015, and it's now declining. And we spend about 1.2% of our budget on aid. That's varied. So it was at its high point after World War II when we were rebuilding Europe. Then it went down, and then went up again after 9/11 when we were investing in Iraq and Afghanistan, and also investing heavily in President Bush's global health program. So right now it's about 0.7%.
So is the UN part of that 0.7% or the 1.2%?
That's a good question, and I'm not sure of the answer. It's not part of the 0.7%, and I think it's separate from the 1.2%, although a lot of the money that we give to aid goes through UN agencies like UNHCR or UNESCO, so I'm not sure that I can give you a firm answer on that. No surprise, our federal budget process doesn't work. Shutdowns are becoming more and more common because politicians refuse to negotiate or even to meet to appear to negotiate, because that's a sign of weakness if you meet with somebody. And the political bases call for this all or nothing strategy that's led to gridlock. Shutdowns aren't really new, but they've become more serious, and there have been shutdowns under most of our previous presidents. So how does this affect state? Well, morale at state, as you can imagine, is not good. It turns out that job satisfaction is very complicated, and it isn't just about money, particularly for the Department of State. We want to be paid, of course, but there's several other factors that play into it. We want to be respected and appreciated. And we need to believe in our mission, and we need to have the ability to carry out that mission. Otherwise, what are we doing there? So in the recent shutdown, 23% of State Department employees overseas and 40% of those in Washington were furloughed. Now, consular services remained open because they're funded separately by visa fees and passport fees. The rest was a shambles. One embassy in Europe was instructed to conserve heat and water because there was no money in the budget to pay utility bills. Diplomats at a consulate in South America had to pay for their own gas to visit American citizens in jail and in prison. I'll say that President Trump apparently has very little regard for diplomacy or the Department of State in general. He pushed for a 30% budget cut for state last year, but he was unable to make the cut thanks to bipartisan support from Congress, which increased our budget. The proposed cuts were so dire that 151 retired senior military commanders, including former chiefs of the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, and Special Operations Command, warned that the cuts could undermine America's global influence at a time of growing threats. In a letter to congressional leaders, the former officers wrote, "We must not undercut our nation's ability to lead around the world in such turbulent times." Rex Tillerson, the President's first Secretary of State, was fired after only 13 months. In that short time, he did a lot of damage. He cut staff by 30%. He instituted a hiring freeze. He left many positions unfilled, and he cut the number of new Foreign Service officer classes. Many senior FSOs just resigned because the unspoken policy was a very slow walk on promotions. So there are fewer and fewer FSOs at senior levels with that kind of experience. In December, the President tweeted that Tillerson was, start tweet, "dumb as a rock, and I couldn't get rid of him fast enough. He was lazy as hell. Now it's a whole new ballgame. Great spirit at stake," end tweet. If wishing only made it so, reality, Mr. President, is far different. How many of you read the article by former Ambassador Nicholas Burns? Okay. No, this was the one in the Great Decisions book. Okay, I'm going to draw from some of it and elaborate on a lot more. But Burns argues that the President set out to reverse 7 decades of American foreign policy in 4 key areas: transatlantic ties, the multilateral trade system, immigration, and what I call despots. First, the President strongly criticized our transatlantic ties. He called the European Union a foe on trade. He argued that NATO and our allies don't pay their fair share, and that the organization had outgrown its usefulness. Well, why was NATO created? To promote and support our shared commitment to democracy, to stand as a bulwark against communism. And what does NATO do for us? The NATO bloc provides us with a greater strategic reach than if we were a country on our own. It always has, and it continues to do that. Now, I don't want to get too much into statistics, but in 2014, the NATO alliance made the commitment, and they agreed on a target. Each country should spend 2% of its GDP on NATO, on defense, by 2024. So that's a 10-year period. By 2016, 2 years later, only 5 of the 21 members had reached this. A couple of years later, it increased to 8 countries. And it's estimated that roughly half will be doing that this year. Half were also on track to reach another NATO budget, which is to spend 20% on military equipment in 2018. In this case, the combination of previous budget commitments that these countries had made, plus President Trump's public scolding, had a positive effect on the commitments. In tweets last July, the President claimed that we pay 90% of NATO's defense, a figure so startling and inaccurate that it boggles the mind. How much do we spend? Again, I'm not going to get real down this road into statistics, but we fund 22% of NATO's common budget based on our GDP. So other countries that have a large GDP, Germany, France, and UK, also pay large amounts. Our total defense spending is 72%, and it's far higher than any other NATO member, but this covers all of our global defense spending around the globe, so it's not just that amount of money on NATO. Our contribution is pretty steady at about 3.5%. There seems to be confusion about our NATO policy from the commander-in-chief on down. There have been a lot of resignations, and I'm just going to mention a few to give you a flavor for what's going on. Because top diplomats and military leaders are resigning at kind of an alarming rate. Jim Melville, the U.S. ambassador to Estonia, quit his post in June, citing Trump's attack on the EU and NATO as grounds for his decision. 2 senior Pentagon officials in charge of ties with NATO stepped down in late 2018. This was at the Assistant Secretary. The former Defense Secretary, Jim Mattis, resigned in December, pointing to the need to maintain strong alliances and respect allies as his key differences with President Trump. When Wes Mitchell, who was the top diplomat responsible for Europe in the State Department, stepped down in January, it only added to the confusion and concern, I think, among our allies. Most of these people left not because they wanted more time with family. They left because of the confusion and the dangerous policy of sowing confusion and doubt about our commitment to NATO. So what and whom do we believe? Should we believe the President when he said in July 2018 at the G7 summit, NATO is worse than the NAFTA trade agreement? Or when he declared that the United States' commitment to NATO remains strong? So what would happen if we were to leave NATO? Mind you, I don't think the President wants to leave NATO, but it's hard to know what he's proposing. So let's play around with this because it goes to what NATO provides for us, which I think is an important thing to keep in mind. This would be a case of penny wise and pound foolish. We'd ostensibly save millions of dollars, but our departure would also require the Pentagon to confront some tough realities. America would lose access to military bases throughout Europe, as well as NATO facilities, ports, and airfields that are vital to our ongoing operations. We have 800 military bases around the world, 800 bases and facilities around the world in 180 countries. There are 38 facilities in Germany alone, and roughly 40,000 of our soldiers are stationed there. We taxpayers would either need to face the burden of building new facilities in foreign countries, or the costs associated with bringing these troops home, arranging jobs for these forces, housing them in decent, safe homes, providing medical services from an already overstressed, inadequate VA system. And we diplomats and military officers would have to negotiate new base rights or drastically change our military strategies, which count on quick, easy access to the world from these forward operating bases. Not very attractive choices. The day after 9/11, NATO joined us in war. There are currently 8,000 NATO soldiers in Afghanistan, alongside about 14,000 Americans, and 1,000 NATO soldiers have been killed. So clearly they have a commitment to us and to our causes. We remain at war, and we remain at risk around the world. And other countries recognize this. So the majority of NATO countries, I think it's 22, have increased defense spending since 2014. Because that was a key date. That was the date of the Russia's annexation of the Crimea, and they realized that there's a threat there. Burns' second point is the President argues the multilateral trade system has hurt us. So he said no to the proposed Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was with 11 other countries of the Americas and Asia, representing about 40% of the global GDP, with the purpose of trying to counter Chinese influence around the world, influence and trade practices that are hurting us. He ended the NAFTA agreement with Canada and Mexico and announced new policies which threatened to set off trade wars with Canada, Mexico, the EU, China, Japan, and South Korea. He's also withdrawn from other international agreements which have taken years to hammer out. Third, Trump has shaken our national consensus of welcoming immigrants and welcoming refugees, I'd say, and legal immigrants to the United States. He enacted a ban on travel from Muslim-specific countries, that was quickly challenged in the court and which led to a very rare, in my mind, the only such protest by 1,000 Foreign Service officers who felt that this was a very short-sighted policy in many ways. But the damage was done, and any credibility that we had with Muslim countries, some of our key allies around the world in the global fight against terrorism, has disappeared. Fourth, he's not spoken out against the rise of anti-democratic populist movements in Hungary, Poland, and Italy. He's been an uncivil critic of our closest allies. And he's fawned over the leaders of North Korea, China, and Russia. These are countries that are considered by most presidents, foreign policy experts, and intelligence specialists as our key adversaries, politically, militarily, and economically. Our president has bragged that he knows more about ISIS than the generals do. I'm not an expert on the military, but I have worked closely with them for 35 years, and it's clear that there's a disconnect between this White House and the military, as well as this White House and the Department of State. One thing we learned early on is the importance of complementing each other. So in our embassies overseas, we have weekly country team meetings, which brings together all the agency heads, and they replicate the president's cabinet meetings in order to coordinate what our response will be, and so people know what everyone's doing. We all seem to be out of the information loop. In January, when the president gave his prime time speech on the border, questions swirled whether he would declare a national emergency in order to gain access to the Department of Defense funds to help build the wall. That has since been answered. But at the time, the point I want to make is that key Pentagon staffers had no insight what he would say or what he would do. So they prepared a press statement announcing the decision to use the funds, even though they weren't sure that the decision had been made, just in case, to have it in their pocket. He didn't consult his top military commander in the Middle East, CENTCOM's General Joseph Votel, before making the abrupt announcement in January that he intended to withdraw all 2,000 U.S. troops from Syria. Will ISIS or other groups see this decision to withdraw our troops as a vulnerability, or will they simply wait until we're gone? Because they're patient, they will play the long game. It also raised questions with our allies who weren't consulted. So NATO countries are members of this coalition, and they're French and British commandos who conduct operations in Syria, who were completely caught off guard by the president's announcement. Pentagon officials have also been unnerved by requests from the White House National Security Council, which continues to ask for options to attack Iran. Military planners say these requests are troubling because there's no real understanding of how Iran might react or exactly what military objective the administration is trying to achieve. Several people have raised an interesting possibility I hadn't thought of, that our military diplomats could be compromised by foreign intelligence operatives. Put more simply, they said, we are more at risk of having our military and diplomats recruited to spy for other countries. The CIA used the principle of MICE, M-I-C-E, MICE, to explain why people agree to spy for a foreign government. And it's a combination of money, it's the M, ideology, it's the I, coercion, C, and ego, MICE. Money is a very powerful motivator, as is the belief in a political system other than your own. Both these factors were very successful during the Cold War for us. Coercion, putting people in a difficult spot that gives you leverage, is very successful. It's It's less savory, perhaps, but it can be very persuasive. And finally, ego. Many of us were raised on romantic spy novels where the beleaguered hero saves the day. People want to feel important. They want to feel that they have a part to play in history. So here are my questions to you to think about. What happens when there's no pay? When federal employees are told they're probably all Democrats with a capital D, or they should just take out a loan? When their loyalty is questioned, their expertise dissed, their commitment to our system shaken, and their bank accounts down to zero? Might they be more susceptible to approaches by foreign governments? A former CIA station chief summed it up very nicely. We target that disgruntled person, the person who was passed over for a promotion, people who aren't being paid, people who aren't being respected by their government. He said if he were a foreign intelligence officer during a government shutdown, he would be in heaven knowing he could lift someone's financial burden or be someone's shoulder to cry on. So the Christmas and New Year shutdown has ended. Actually, as I was originally writing this, we were looking at another one, but the point is still the same. What kind of message has this sent to countries around the world? How does a dysfunctional government help us sell democracy overseas? I mentioned I wanted to talk a little bit about democracy, and some of you may have asked yourselves, what does democracy have to do with the state of state? Well, one of our major goals overseas is to promote democracy. It's a goal that's hard to, it's a hard task even under the best of circumstances. To be blunt, it's more difficult thanks to a combination of advanced technology and this particular president. So let's turn for a minute to democracy. Less than half the world is considered democratic. At one time, skeptics questioned whether democracy might work in countries such as Italy, Germany, Japan, Spain, and Latin America in general. Our willingness and ability to help others is a large part of our identity and our pride as Americans. Our involvement in the world, our willingness to help, it promotes a positive view of the United States and by extension of our system of government. It's hard to promote democracy. The first problem is deciding where to promote it. So the United States has wide and very conflicting long-term and short-term interests. We have to balance those. But we do try to be consistent. Democracy, we say, offers the best chance for stable, prosperous countries. Alliances which seem to be in our short-term interest may be very troublesome later on. For instance, our support of the Mujahideen and bin Laden in Afghanistan and Mobutu in Zaire. Old examples, but still very apt. The second one is choosing how or what tools to use. Each case is different, and what might work in one case might not work in another country. And to make matters more complicated, a lot of it's about timing. So the third question is when to make those efforts. Promoting democracy is difficult. It's especially difficult when we have an inconsistent, tweet-driven foreign policy. What we say matters. What we decide to comment on matters. And sadly, what the president tweets also matters. One of our key tools in promoting democracy has always been to give encouragement and to lead by example. In 1995, when I had to close one of our embassies in West Africa because of the American budget stalemate, I was able to say with confidence that our military would not step in and that we would reach a compromise. These are things that are not givens overseas. They're very unusual. They're things that we can be proud of. In late 2000, when the results of the presidential election remained in suspense for 5 weeks, we knew the court would reach a decision, and we knew that Americans would accept that decision. I'm a big fan of the TV show Madam Secretary, despite its simplicity. In the real world, problems aren't usually solved in an hour as much as we might want them to. It's nice the way they're all wrapped up at the end of each episode. they're much more likely to drag on, and they're solved incrementally by painstaking work. Diplomacy is about consistency in building relationships. I'm just going to say that. Diplomacy is about consistency in building relationships. Overseas, we have key contacts that are passed on to our successors. Those of you who are Foreign Service officers will know this. Back in the day when there was originally a week's overlap overseas, the Deputy Chief of Mission or the Ambassador would give a hail and farewell party. The purpose wasn't to thank the departing officer for a job well done, although that was part of it. The main goal was for the officer who'd earned trust in that country to pass the baton on to the new person. A personal introduction went a long way in continuing what was often a long relationship with the embassy and starting a new one with the new officer. So America and our government has managed to muddle through some difficult times based on shared respect for our institutions and the checks and balances provided by strong separate branches of government. That isn't true today. How can we lead when we are a nation led by uncivil, polarized leaders? And I'm not just talking about one person. Uncivil, polarized leaders. Secretary Tillerson, whom you may recall, was apparently dumb as a rock, found out he was fired by one of the president's early morning tweets. Our ambassador to Mexico, Roberta Jacobson, learned we were pulling out of the NAFTA trade agreement when she received frantic emails and calls from reporters and Mexican officials who wanted to know what was going on. So she reached out to Washington, but she couldn't reach Secretary Tillerson. This is unbelievable. A cabinet secretary in a post like diplomacy or defense is always reachable in an emergency. Always. So, the Mexican president asked her, incredulously, is your president going to pull out of NAFTA before we've even had a chance to sit down and work on this? Well, the answer is yes. Ambassador Jacobson resigned in May 2018, and she's since felt free to comment a bit. She said, some chaos is normal at the start of an administration, but it has been extreme under Mr. Trump. Ambassadors are left in impossible positions, and our allies across the globe are infuriated, alienated, and bewildered. Infuriated, alienated, and bewildered. At the same time that the president is posting early morning tweets, undermining the basis of our diplomatic and military strategies, his own written national security strategy is actually very clear. I don't think he's drawing from it, because it says a strong and free Europe is of vital importance to the U.S. It describes future threats from China and a Russian state that has interfered in democratic processes in Europe, as well as annexing by force territory in Crimea and Georgia. So what are we to present as our foreign policy? What impact can we have in a world dominated by technology and a president who makes foreign policy, often without knowing it, by tweet? So, despite the president's claim that there's a great spirit at stake, and Secretary Pompeo's moniker that we're now the Department of Swagger, if you haven't heard, the Department of State is now the Department of Swagger. Morale at state is dismal. When I reached out to my diplomat friends, it was very hard to get them to comment. I wasn't asking them to comment on policy, administration, anything political. I was simply asking about morale. Even through their personal emails, which of course is where I reached them, they didn't want to comment. Several offered some tantalizing hints and said they looked forward to talking to me in person. Most were reluctant to share their thoughts, but let me close by sharing a few thoughts from a few brave FSOs in Washington and around the world who did share. People are doing their jobs out of a sense of responsibility, but have no hope of success. The current trade policy is nonsensical. In terms of morale, many people find the goings-on nothing short of absurd. This one was from a British-raised friend of mine. The disparaging or tin-eared comments about federal workers in some quarters was particularly unbecoming in a democracy. We're all keeping a low profile. No one wants to speak in a public forum. Who wants to choose between lying or committing career suicide? I was particularly disappointed in the lack of leadership or good communication. We got no answers from Washington. No one took responsibility. Younger diplomats were left disheartened and confused by their experience. Not to mention, I was the subject of jokes from the government officials and other foreign diplomats who pitied me. In this administration, military intelligence and diplomatic experts are largely ignored. And we're losing credibility, influence, and leverage around the world as a result of our dysfunctional government. If you take one thing away from this presentation, perhaps it should be something I said earlier. Diplomacy is about consistency and building relationships. The goodwill and trust we work hard to establish overseas are being shaken by our inconsistent and unpredictable foreign policy. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.